Begin. Number one, I want to underscore what we heard in the last period of time, which is one of the wonderful things that has occurred over the last 25 years has been genuine cooperation between Washington and Jerusalem on the archives, and there is now accessibility and mutual accessibility, which allows scholarship to flourish. And it's one of the examples of where competition is enhanced by cooperation, makes both institutions better, and also empowers scholars to be able to do their work on multiple continents in all sorts of ways. We've cooperated in copying archives, we've cooperated in dissemination, and it is a model of what scholarship needs. And we have to salute our colleagues at Yad Vashem for their cooperation, which is not always, has not always been the case on both sides. Mutual suspicion and mutual competition has given way to cooperation. Would that it were to happen in other aspects of the world in which we live, but the Messiah has not yet come. The second is I want to say something about the largest issue we're dealing with here, which is the question of nations facing their own history. This is a deeply hot political topic in the United States. And if it's happening in the United States, in the great and long tradition of democracy, as to whether you can face American history, the history of slavery, and the history of oppression, the history of Jim Crow, the history of the reception and non-reception of immigrants. Imagine other countries which have a much more shallow democratic tradition. And it's characteristic of the world in which we live in, and we can go through all sorts of aspects of the world in which we live in. You can all name the countries as well as I can name, but it's a very large problem. And it's going to make, in certain states in the United States, the task of historians enormously difficult. And I can only indicate that when I speak in Poland, the deal I make in Poland with my Polish colleagues is I will be more radical than they will be on the role of the Polish institutions, government, and Poles themselves. So if they target them, they have to target me. And the assumption is that my colleagues would create an international scandal that's a little bit louder were something to happen to me. I'm not certain of that, but that's the given premise involved. The third point I want to make before I begin is that we've learned a couple of things here as well which we shouldn't lose sight of, which has implications for the United States, implications for Israel as well, which is we've learned a very simple truth that citizenship counts. That human rights and the ability of governments to protect are in part dependent upon citizenship and on the status of citizenship. And that's a large moral conclusion, and how it impacts itself in all sorts of societies is a very important question, but let's not lose sight, as we go through the weeds, let's not lose sight of the largest story of the forest. Last preliminary point, and I promise to get to my remarks in a second. Last preliminary point is about language. We have a problem in Bulgaria and in the role of Bulgaria because essentially historians have conventional language. We have the language of perpetrator, we have the language of victim, we have the language of bystander, and we also have the language introduced by the pedagogical field of Holocaust studies of upstander, which is of those who do right. And one of the problems of language that we just discovered, that we just understood, is something I wrote about 30 years ago. And this is with all due and really significant respect to Yad Vashem. The State of Israel elevated the language of rescue beyond what is accessible. And that is, it calls the rescuers righteous, and we understand tzadikei umot olam and all of that. But the problem is educationally, the problem is that aside from yeshivot and parochial schools, most people don't aspire to be righteous, they may aspire to be decent. And righteous puts it too high, and then how can you describe, for example, Oskar Schindler as righteous when you consider the role he had in gaining his fortune, and the way in which he treated his wife, the way in which he exploited Jewish labor, and everything else until the moment that he acted in the way he did. And we've all seen the multiple roles of the Bulgarian society. So you could describe Bulgaria as heroic rescuers, as they would like to describe themselves, as brutal what? As brutal oppressors. You could describe them as bystanders. The reality is we have to emphasize one thing about Bulgaria, which is that civil society, and this is essential, I would hesitate to say that we're seeing the role of civil society in this country at this time in an uncivil atmosphere. Civil society is very important as long as civil society is articulate and stands up and stands out. And we have that problem not only in Israel, it's a problem that we face very strongly in the United States as well. Now, my task, these are the preliminary words, which, and the like. My task is a little bit different, which is that I am, with regard to Bulgaria, I am not a producer of knowledge, but a consumer of knowledge and a transmitter of knowledge. My assignment a while back was to create the Museum of the Holocaust in Skopje. Now, obviously, if you create a Museum of the Holocaust in Skopje, the Bulgarians are not quite going to become the heroes of the dramatic action. And in fact, our problem with I work in that sense with clients. Thankfully, I'm at the stage where I'm not particularly afraid of being fired, so I can struggle with my clients. But you have to imagine that describing anything nice about the Bulgarians in the context of Skopje and in the context of what is now North Macedonia, and we had language of that, was not easy. And consequently, I'm telling the story of the victimization. Let me show you a bit about the museum and then talk about how you shape a museum and what it means pedagogically. And let me make one more large point, which I make here because this is co-sponsored by Yad Vashem. We've been asking for an entire generation a question, a very, very large question, which is who are going to be the heirs of the survivors? And the answer has now come forth without being quite articulated, and we all know that in Life of Survivors, we're either at 1159 or 1201. In other words, the generation of survivors, how many survivors are left? The easiest answer is there are less today than there were yesterday, and it's guaranteed there will be less tomorrow than there were today. But the heirs of the survivors are the museums that are telling their stories. And the other part of it is a museum then creates and has to do programming and the like, including conferences like this, which is part of the research arm. So the heirs become museums, which museums means, and museums are permanent, unlike, or relatively permanent, unlike, for example, films, which have a shelf life. And consequently, museums tell a very particular story. Let me show you a little bit about what we're seeing here, and then we'll talk. Macedonian Jewry are ancient. The oldest synagogue outside the land of Israel is the Jewish community has been there since before the Common Era. The history of Macedonian Jewry also encompasses Jewish Renaissance in Spain, and it also deals with the incredible period of we'll then deal with the unique period of the Holocaust, again, I've existed for some 3 weeks.
The challenge of creating the exhibit from culture of this tornado of suitcases. Begin to understand what the people themselves were thinking. And that's why and of the most dramatic elements is the train car that is completely model so that people could understand how in space, almost 1 million people can be murdered and destroyed. Explanations of the Treblinka experience. Cause of a giant shovel from a bulldozer, and then a story of the partisan uprising. All empty pictures that we've seen.
This museum, I thought I was only going to learn about the Holocaust, but I actually learned a lot about the Jewish community as a whole. It was a really enlightening experience, and I was deeply touched by all the things that they've gone through, all the discrimination that has been placed upon them.
This museum will be a fitting tribute to those Jewish life that thrived in Macedonia, but is remembrance from the past and sees. Let me give you Museum 101 for a second, and that is the museum has to answer 4 essential questions. Museum has to answer what, where, with what, and how. What is the story you have to tell? In Macedonia, the story we had to tell took on a very series of unique problems. Number one, 99% of the visitors of the museum will not know Jews and will never have met a Jew. Macedonian Jewry now is about 200 to 250 people. It's not a group that has a great prominence within the community. We had to teach them that, first of all, who was a Jew and a little bit about what is Judaism, not a lot, because that's not the task. We also had to teach them a sense about the rootedness of Macedonian Jewry. The synagogue in Stobi precedes Paul of Tarsus, went to Macedonia. We also ironically then had to teach about the Jewish life in Spain. And we had the use of an incredible artifact which answers the question not only what do you say, but a little bit with what, which is because the most famous Jewish artifact in the Balkans is the Sarajevo Haggadah. And the Sarajevo Haggadah is the most famous artifact in the Balkans. We have a facsimile of it, which also allows us to tell the story of Passover. We tell the story of the Inquisition and the expulsion. the rebirth of Jewish life in the Balkans as a result of the Inquisition and the expulsion. And then we tell the story about the life of the Jewish community of Macedonia before. We tell a little bit of the story of Ladino. We tell a lot of the story of the dimensions of the community. We have one unique problem because the most famous person buried right outside the museum in an area that was covered by the earthquake was Nathan of Gaza, Shabtai Tzvi's John the Baptist. And consequently, we have to tell the story of Shabtaut in a very interesting way, just enough to be able to make sense of it because we are literally overlooking the grave of Nathan of Gaza. We had two problems then. One is we had to tell the context for which the Holocaust occurred in Macedonia. And that context includes the entire world of what was happening in Germany and in the German expansionism and the German decision for the final solution. And then we had to talk about the unique aspects of Bulgarian occupation, and then turn directly to the experience, and we had a wonderful physical enormous advantage because that was the moment at which we could switch floors. And if you switch floors in a museum, you have to understand that however many floors you have, the play has to be in multiple acts, and every time you descend or ascend, you change the narrative. We then tell the story. We tell the story of descent. We tell the story of essentially of leaving home. And we had one tremendous advantage artifactually, which is that the archives still contained some of the envelopes which contained the keys to homes, because Macedonian Jewry, when they left, were to deposit their keys and write their address. And we have the wonderful testimony of a survivor who said, I wrote an address that was wrong, and I hope they're still searching all over the goddamn place for the key that fits the lock to my home. We then descend, we go into Treblinka. We go into deportation, which is the train, one of the most powerful artifacts that we have in museum speak. We then go into Treblinka, we present the model of Treblinka, and then we present Treblinka within the context, within the largest context of Action Reinhardt. So in this museum, for example, Auschwitz or Majdanek or Belzec or Sobibor take a minor position because we're telling the story of Macedonia. And Macedonia, the deportation was from Monopol to Treblinka, and no one returned from Treblinka. Last couple of points I want to make is you always have a problem with the conclusion of a museum, and every story has to have a beginning and every story has to have an end. And the problem of the conclusion, first of all, liberation for Macedonian Jewry was enormously complex because they had no idea of what happened to the Jews who were deported to Treblinka, and it took a significant period of time for word of Treblinka to come out because there were so few survivors of Treblinka. So you have the description of people who for a year heard a knock on the door and wondered if that was a relative coming home. And only after a while did they understand that there was no one coming home and that all who had gone to Treblinka were dead. So liberation has a bitter quality to it and not only a liberating quality to it. And then we had to struggle with the community to tell the story of the aftermath because the Macedonian community is a shadow of itself. There is what we call as a metaphor and as a creative metaphor, the presence of absence and the absence of presence. If you want to have a physical remnant of that, there's a magnificent physical remnant of that when you see the indentation where once there were mezuzot. 300, 500 years there were mezuzot on a door, and all you have now is the indentation in the frame where mezuzot once existed, and that's both the absence of presence and the presence of absence. We then talk about the movement of Macedonian Jewry who survived, actually of Balkan Jewry, who survived to Palestine and then Israel. And we show the remnant of the remnant of the remnant of the Jewish community that came back. We had to give the community the dignity it deserves in the attempt to preserve Jewish life, even in this tiny remnant, 200, 250 people. But you have to understand also the integration of that community. And we also showed, and you saw the great mural for partisans, because in the areas of Yugoslavia, most particularly in Macedonia, the Jews did not fight separately. The Jews fought as part of the general population. The museum stands in the center of Skopje. It's within sight of the Museum of the History of Skopje. It's within sight of the Supreme Court. And that says something about the role that the government permitted the Jews to have, to tell their story of a Jewish community that is almost is no longer in the center of the national narrative. And you can imagine that we had to present what happened in Bulgaria as an attempt that Bulgaria deported the Jews of Thrace and Macedonia, signed the documents to deport their own, and only then did civil society erupt. And again, it creates a complex story, but the Holocaust is never an easy story. Thank you.